Hi, welcome to our webinar today. My name is Robert Starmer. I'm with Cumulus Technologies. We're a Bay Area cloud technology consultancy, and we have our guest panelists here who will introduce themselves now.
Hello everybody, I'm Amit Gupta. I run product strategy for Tigera. And for those of you who don't know about Tigera, we are the network security company primarily for your modern applications running on modern infrastructure. Really looking forward to the discussion today.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sushmita. I'm part of the Kubernetes platform team at Box. At Box, I primarily work on expanding Box's platform capabilities to public cloud, especially AWS.
Hey guys, my name is Omar Lari. I'm a business development manager for container services at Amazon Web Services. So I support all of our container services, including ECS, Fargate, now EKS, and our container registry service. So yeah, happy to be here and excited to have this conversation with you guys today.
Great. So we have a great set of panelists, obviously, and the topic that we wanted to cover was sort of the migration and convergence of security on top of this great container platform, right? We've seen a huge explosion of use. People want to use containers, especially in enterprise applications and of course cloud-enabled applications, which is sort of where this got its start. I think one of the first questions that people often have when they're trying to understand what's going on in the space is, what is it that needs to happen? What do enterprises need to be aware of when they start thinking about how containers change the security mindset or sort of the functionality of providing security in that new paradigm? Who would like to start? How about Amit? Why don't you go from the infrastructure perspective?
Sure, and Robert, I think I completely agree with you in terms of how container adoption has significantly gone up in enterprises. When you think about that from a security perspective, there's a lot that needs to be taken into account as you design your security architecture, as you think about securing these containerized applications, because if you look at 5 or 10 years ago, the way to secure your legacy application was you put a file integrity monitoring tool, you look for indicator of compromise, and you catch that and you know there's something that's going wrong, you need to work around that. Well, that world is not applicable anymore.
Right.
Your threat vectors are a lot more complex, and these applications, they're a lot more dynamic and a lot more ephemeral. So when you think about securing these applications in this infrastructure, you have to think about how you're going to automate your security workflows, how you're going to build rules, security policies in a highly dynamic fashion, how you're going to think about bringing down security, not just your application architecture into a microservices world, but also thinking about how you're going to reduce your security perimeter all the way down to your workloads. So those are all in my opinion, what I've seen with the users, key aspects that you have to think about as you design security or look at the impact of this from an organization perspective.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I also think on the infrastructure side, there's definitely more layers, right? And if you're running things like Kubernetes or any other kind of orchestration system, you also have to look at the security of the underlying infrastructure and how much of that you want to manage yourself, right? So you have a lot of things like resource management and scheduling, and where do you store all of that data, and how do you make sure that that's secure and kept, in a manageable fashion. And doing a lot of that work yourself is a lot of undifferentiated heavy lifting that the customers have to do by themselves. So leveraging more and more managed services that allow you to really focus on securing your applications and building your applications for the business value that your organization brings alleviates, your engineers having to spend time on that and on that infrastructure and that component of it. So I think that's another just important aspect of, security of containerized environments.
Sure. I mean, understanding the infrastructure and knowing where your limits are in terms of managing that infrastructure, right? I mean, Sushmita, for your view, I mean, from an actual customer using these tools and building tools on top, what are you seeing in terms of that interaction at the sort of the infrastructure to systems interaction for security? Are there specific things that you think people should be looking at, or that you guys are able to talk about looking at from that perspective?
So definitely there is security can be at several aspects, and then the first one would be at the underlying infrastructure. There are some of the kernel modules that you can utilize that the operating system itself gives you, like SELinux, security enhanced Linux, etc., that you could enable in the underlying operating system for the Kubernetes infrastructure itself, and that can provide good container isolation and minimize the amount of access that you can give to files or network resources, etc., and minimize the container breakout scenarios.
Sure. And when you're looking at that, I mean, is this something that you would normally be considering as a part of just sort of the deployment? I mean, like if we're deploying on AWS, or even if you're deploying on private infrastructure, is that something that you are currently managing? From my experience in some of the companies that I've worked with, security is sort of like that add-on, that adjunct sort of a thing. Yeah, we'll think about it later. Are you able to start building that into your infrastructure deployment processes, or is it after the fact sort of a thing or not, I guess is kind of the question.
It's definitely not after the fact. It's very integral to the way we work at Box. And we have several Kubernetes data centers, and there are, we hope to expand to public cloud. So we still have our own, we package our own RPMs. So we have SELinux enabled, our own custom AMIs, etc. And we want to use or leverage the same level of capabilities in public cloud or on-premise, and it's very much integral and part of the process at Box.
Yeah, actually, it's probably a good point, right? So when we start thinking about it, yeah, infrastructure is that first layer, but then we have to start building on top, right? And one of the things that most people do when they first go into containerization, I mean, you guys can tell me if you see different things, but people will go to the basically Docker Hub and say, well, what container do I want to build off of? Let me start with a RHEL container or an Ubuntu container, and I'll go from there. And there's almost no thought given to the security aspect of that infrastructure. So your point, saying, well, we have to build from scratch effectively to make sure that we can stack the security up as we build it. What are you guys seeing?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very key aspect of the design pattern around how you do security for containers. You cannot wait till the end when the application is being deployed in the runtime to think about how you're going to secure it. You have to start planning around it. Even when you're designing your application, what images you pull from Docker Hub, how are you going to make sure they do not have any vulnerabilities in there, what configuration you're deploying. You're going to have to do all of those assessments as part of your deployment pipeline. Super critical. And then when it actually gets to the runtime, you do have to make sure all of this is done automated, and then you put all the mitigating controls, all your segmentation boundaries, isolation boundaries, all as part of the application deployment process. Very critical to do it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of, there's two concepts I kind of like in that stage, is like the preventative and detective, right? Like, especially when you're pulling images off Docker Hub, like, okay, you can prevent certain things from going in, and they may have vulnerabilities on that day, but once it actually makes it into your infrastructure, new vulnerabilities come up. So you have to have methodologies for, isolating that and capturing that and being able to detect that and take appropriate action. So it's not always, it's secure on day 0, but day 1 and day 2, there's also potential for exposure, so you need to be continuously watching that. Depending on what your release velocity is, that might be something that you need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, are you guys seeing a lot of shift in terms of the, for the two of you that aren't at a company or aren't at an end user company, I guess, in a way of thinking about it, are you seeing a lot of shift towards continuously integrating the security aspects as well? I mean, I'm assuming at Box you're already doing that, and so I'd love your feedback on that as well. But what are you guys seeing in terms of the kind of integration of security as a part of the development process?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think not just as part of the pipelines, but in the review of the code itself, right? And when it actually gets checked into your source code repository, there's security reviews that are happening very early in the process. And as that code continues to go through the pipeline, you continuously have checks, right? Then there's the code piece of it, there's the image scanning piece of it, there's the underlying infrastructure piece of it, and when it actually makes it into a staging environment, additional vulnerabilities that you can test in. So I mean, I'm seeing more and more customers be security conscious earlier on in the process, and catching those things earlier, and less afterwards. It leaves less work for them to have to do, once they actually deploy into production.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that. So I fully agree with you, Omar. I would also add that if you think about the pipeline that we're talking about for the code and the applications, I mean, the moment you check in your code, your orchestrators, your CI/CD processes and orchestrators will start picking up that code and running what they need to do to activate your pipeline, deploy the code into your pre-production, production servers. So if that's the case, how your application is being deployed, you actually do not have any choice but to do security as part of the pipeline in an automated fashion. So if you actually care about the security of those applications, you really have to just fully automate that, and we see that across almost all of our user base.
And I think it changes the behavior of the developer too, right? Because they start being more conscious earlier on in the process as opposed to patching things later. It's like, hey, I need to think about this first because otherwise it's going to fail in this part of the pipeline. So
there is no such thing as patching in container world.
Right.
You kill the container, bring a new one. So you can't rely on those traditional models that most of these users would have been in the old application architectures.
I mean, from the perspective of your life at Box, I mean, have you seen major changes in the culture about where security fits in the life cycle, especially as people are moving to containerized processes, so the whole workflow around building and managing containers? Is that an area that is expanding? Or are there any like best practices that you're not seeing others do that you really wish they would because you're seeing real value for yourselves? Is that something you can talk about? Or?
So from platform point of view, we typically try to relieve service owners of some of the pressure of considering all the security aspects of it. So we kind of have controls in the platform itself that stop users from getting into those situations that can cause security vulnerabilities.
Okay.
For example, like the platform itself, we kind of have a monorepo where all service owners check in their deployment config, and there are periodic scans on the repo to see if does any pod really use more security capabilities than it should ideally use. Are these privileged containers? We minimize the use of privileged containers as much as possible because in a container breakout case, I mean, a privileged container can cause more harm than any other regular container.
Right.
And we also ensure that critical changes are only done by the platform owners and not really by the service owners. For example, setting namespace level restrictions on how much resources they can use, for example. What is the memory limit per service, the hard limit that you can impose, etc. So we enforce them at the platform layer so that most of the burden is taken away from the service owners.
Okay, so